everyone, and welcome back to the Progress Report. Perspective and news progressives can use. I'm your host, Ron Rivers. It's September 6, 2019, and our weekend review today will focus on Hong Kong earning a small victory, Wal-Mart versus the NRA, Elizabeth Warren's Green New Deal, England's political courage, and new technology breakthroughs that you should know about. Thanks as always for tuning into the Progressive Perspective. If you haven't been paying attention to Hong Kong, you should be. Before we dive into the modern day happenings, let's talk about a brief history of the Hong Kong situation and why the intensity of the protests is so high. On July 1st, 1997, Hong Kong was returned to the control of China after 156 years of British colonial rule. The Basic Law was enacted on the day of the handover, and the Hong Kong Basic Law sets out the sources of law, essentially the relationship between Hong Kong and the central Chinese government, the fundamental rights and freedoms of the Hong Kong residents, and the structure and functions of the branches of local government in Hong Kong. Essentially allows for the one nation, two systems that presently exist in China. Diving in a bit more specifically, it granted Hong Kong residents freedoms that many of us take for granted here in the United States. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, of association, freedom of communication, of movement, of religion, marriage, workers' unions, and the right to strike. Now compare that to mainland China, which is essentially at this point an autocratic regime exercising communist modes of production to advance state dominion. The extradition law was the ember that lit the fire among the Hong Kong people, because the bill would allow Hong Kong to detain and transfer people wanted in countries and territories with which it has no formal extradition agreements, for example like Taiwan and Chinese mainland. Carrie Lam, who is Hong Kong's chief executive, has said that the new law is urgently needed to prosecute a Hong Kong man who's wanted in Taiwan for the murder of his girlfriend. But the Hong Kong people recognize the negative potential this bill might have and have responded in kind with civil unrest that it should inspire every American. The protesters are a people who are putting themselves at great risk to ensure their personal freedoms. The protesters have 5 core demands, and they are as follows. The first is to fully withdraw the extradition bill. Now it's important that we understand withdrawing versus just tabling the bill. Tabling the bill allows it to come back up quicker and be rushed through the legislative process. Withdrawing it totally removes it from the process, requiring an entirely new vote to get it put out for consideration, which would greatly slow the process, which is why the protesters are demanding an extradition of the bill. They want to set up an independent inquiry to probe police brutality. If you guys have been watching any of the videos on YouTube, Facebook, you see them, I'm sure. The Hong Kong police are being very brutal with the protesters. I mean, just flagrantly attacking civilians who are not in any way, shape, or form being offensive, and beating them pretty severely with clubs, kicking them, punching them while they're down. They've been spraying people with blue dye as of lately to mark them for further persecution after the event. So they want an independent inquiry to be able to probe police brutality. They want a formal withdrawal of the characterization of the protests as riots. Right? Riots bring a certain amount of legal and political clout with them. When you have a riot, you assume destruction. The Hong Kong protesters, for the most part, have not been very destructive. It's been peaceful protests. And they want to make sure that the official story classifies them as protests, not riots. They want to release those who are arrested at the protests. That's a big thing. Those people who have been protesting and been arrested for exercising their freedom of speech as per the Basic Law. And the 5th demand is to implement universal suffrage in Hong Kong. As of this past Wednesday, that was September 4th, Hong Kong leader Carrie Lam withdrew the extradition bill, completing one of the 5 tasks. However, it seems from my perspective that the protest from all accounts is much bigger than the initial bill at this time. My observations from various forums about the issue seem to be that the Hong Kong protesters have no intention of stopping now. While the Hong Kong issue is not in our backyard, it's something that I would argue progressives should be paying very close attention to and thinking deeply about. First, we have to admire their ability to activate. The Hong Kong people have been really incredible at inspiring in that. These people are willing to do what it takes to demand their freedom, even if that means genuinely risking their lives in the process. This level of commitment is something every progressive should contemplate. Specifically, what is your breaking point? What I mean by that is, at what point do you stop going to work and join others in non-stop protest? Is it, for example, Trump refusing to leave office in 2020? Is it increasing the already harsh treatment of our border concentration camps, otherwise known as ICE detention centers? Or are you just waiting for the American public to revolt against Citizens United in an emergent moment of clarity? Personally, I've been organizing local rallies for a few years now, but the true breaking point for me would be if the 2020 election were undermined. Again, I ask you progressives, what is your breaking point? Make sure you comment below and join the discussion. Second is mainland China's response. We should avoid the mistake of presuming the Chinese operate by traditional Americanized values. I say traditional because the present administration has worked its hardest to erode those values. The protests come at a tough time for China, with Trump's elevation of the trade war and slowing economic activity for them. The withdrawal of the extradition bill is a huge loss of face for the Communist Chinese Party, but the question now is, how much farther are they willing to go? Meanwhile, the world is watching, and we shouldn't be so confident that this won't end badly with police or military violence. In the end, the people of Hong Kong are a free people who face incredible uncertainty in their future. How do progressives stand on this issue, and what pathways are we willing to take? It's a weighted question, something that all of us need to explore more. You know, we hear a lot about the progressive movement in terms of internal policy here, but what about geopolitical strategy? When we deal with China, we're dealing with a regime that is fundamentally different than the United States and operates in a fundamentally different paradigm. They are a centralized government, so to them, it's all about how to maximize their influence and power by whatever means necessary. They don't tolerate dissent like we do here in the United States. Although both countries are a spy state, theirs is much more aggressive. People disappear in China. And it's really interesting. I mean, this is what I'm about to say now is purely anecdotal, but if you read forums and you read posts by people who claim to be Chinese expats, many of them are very supportive of Trump's trade war, essentially arguing that playing diplomacy and looking for mutual agreements with a country like China under its present leadership is a fruitless effort, which is really fascinating. This is something that Henry Kissinger talks about in his book, World Order. Now, I'll go on record, I'm not a Henry Kissinger fan. I don't believe that he's led a career of moral and dignified work in terms of his atrocities throughout the world. But as a progressive, we seek radical truth, right? So that we cannot discount perspectives of individuals just because we don't agree with their public policy. However horrible it might be, we need to consider their perspective and just understand why they did it. Kissinger talks a lot about this, about the concept of Westphalian values, essentially the argument that Westphalian values are a value of freedom of expression, freedom of pursuit of your own pathway to happiness, freedom to collaborate with whom you want to collaborate with. And when we have right now in the world is really fascinating with the Russia and China kind of combination is two significant nations, at least significant on the geopolitical scale, who share drastically different values than the United States. And it's something that I think about a lot, and we need to kind of explore probably in a different podcast, a more focused podcast about China. But let's imagine for a moment progressives did win the White House and we were in total control. Let's say a Senate, the House of Representatives. Let's say we just had a progressive government. How would a progressive government deal with an authoritarian regime that is seemingly hell-bent on extending its influence and reach throughout the world? Do we allow them to? Do we step back and just say, hey, whatever works? Do we try and dissuade it? Do we partner with them, or do we reject partnership on accounts of their human rights violations? Do we say, as the United States, that you are only going to work with countries that are, that believe in the same values that we do? Because, I believe as a progressive, the real vision of the progressives today isn't necessarily encompassing really our true emergent potential as people, and that is a globally integrated system. I think there's many reasons for that we can discuss at another date, why we're not kind of talking about that at this time. But I believe that emergence theory and social philosophy is possible. We can transcend the nation state before we can even fix it, I would argue, because fixing the existing nation state regimes is really dealing with over 250 years in the Americans' history, of calcified institutional arrangements, and more so than that, we can't seem to drum up enough excitement to change basic things like major corruption in our politics. So we may need a more global vision forward, and that global vision includes dealing with and how we deal with countries that just share radically different viewpoints than ours and treat people in a radically different way. Moving on, after the recent El Paso shooting at a Wal-Mart store that left 22 people dead, the company banned the open carry of firearms in its stores, cut down on its ammo offerings, and banned the sale of handguns in Alaska. Now, the National Rifle Association, the NRA, was quick to chime in on Twitter saying, and I quote, "It is shameful to see Walmart succumb to the pressure of the anti-gun elites," end quote. Another quote was, "Lines at Walmart will soon be replaced by lines at other retailers who are more supportive of America's fundamental freedoms." Now, as a progressive, we might say, hey, this is a great thing, right? Well, no, I'd argue not really. The truth is that Walmart CEOs see the writing on the wall, and it reads that Americans across the country are getting fed up with congressional cowardice when it comes to gun control. The largest study on gun control systematically analyzed 130 studies that had been conducted across 10 different countries, including the United States, Australia, Brazil, South Africa, and Austria. It concluded that restricting access to guns and their purchase is associated with reductions in firearm deaths. So let me say it again for all of us progressives, because this is a big deal. We know for a fact that the largest study linked restrictions on gun sales to decreased deaths. Okay? They make mass shootings go down. That's a fact. Now, they also concluded it usually takes major legislative overhaul, not just one new law, to see significant change. And these legislative overhauls are things that we already know about: banning assault weapon sales, deeper and more intense background checks, closing loopholes like purchasing firearms at gun shows. For example, in South Africa in 2000, the Firearm Control Act contained these measures and saw a 13.6% reduction in firearm homicides every single year for the 5 years after they released the bill. A similar overhaul law was introduced in Australia in 1996 in the wake of a mass murder. And according to one study, overall firearm death rates decreased by 14% the following year. These laws were also shown to decrease homicides and unintended child deaths. As a progressive with conservative, libertarian, and traditional Democrat friends who all love their guns, I can't help but observe a level of dissociation. As if, because the shootings aren't impacting them directly, that it's easy to disassociate with the fact that we have mass murders going on the regular here in the United States. I did a bit of research, and as of September 2nd, 2019, there have been 289 mass shootings in the United States, resulting in 312 deaths and 1,290 injuries this year alone. Now, take a moment to digest those numbers. There's no shame in being a responsible gun owner while simultaneously recognizing that we have a genuine crisis on our hand that historical data shows can be mitigated and reduced with more restrictive gun laws. Let's not make a hero out of Walmart either. This is an economic decision for Walmart, not a moral one. Walmart is taking a calculated risk to begin cracking down slightly, not genuinely by the way, their changes are very small. The Walton family spends a significant amount of their fortune on political donations, traditionally favoring conservative candidates. They embody everything wrong with American democracy, and that is to say oligarchy in disguise. On to news that makes us feel better. Elizabeth Warren just announced her Green New Deal plan. I've taken some time to read over it. I want to give you some highlights. So it introduces a Green Apollo program, a $400 billion commitment to clean energy research over the next decade, with protections in place to ensure that technology is manufactured here in the United States, not overseas. I love candidates who are serious about empowering the United States research and development sector. We have historically been the innovative capital of the planet, and that is the new economy, the new knowledge economy. That is how we are going to succeed and create more and more wealth for our society. So any type of investment, especially ensuring that it stays in the United States, is huge, and I'm very happy to see Senator Warren put that forth. Her plan also includes a $1.5 trillion subsidy towards the consumer transition to clean and renewable electricity, zero-emission vehicles, and green products for commercial and residential buildings. Key milestones include, by 2028, is reaching 100% zero carbon pollution for all new commercial and residential buildings. By 2030, attaining 100% zero emissions for all new light-duty passenger vehicles, medium-duty trucks, and all buses. And by 2035, achieving 100% clean, renewable, and zero-emission energy and electricity generation. Warren's plan mentions her opposition to the Keystone XL, Dakota Access, and Line 3 pipelines as well. She talks about the Conservation Stewardship Program, a program compensating farmers transitioning to sustainable practices. I personally love this idea. Including farmers as stakeholders in the transition process is a collaborative approach to solving a collective problem. More importantly, this is how we tie rural America into the progressive movement, is by including them in as stakeholders. It's an idea that shows a ton of promise and, more importantly, expands our imagination of what is possible in terms of increasing stakeholders within the United States. Now, if it sounds like I'm excited about Warren's plan, it's because I am. But there is one significant thing missing. Warren's plan does not mention a moratorium on all new fossil fuel projects. A moratorium would stop all new construction in the United States for any projects extracting fossil fuels, including fracking. Unfortunately, this is a deal breaker for me. The logic that I approach this with is pretty straightforward. We're in the midst of a crisis. In order to remove ourselves from the crisis, we need to immediately stop digging ourselves deeper into it. If we allow for the new construction of fossil fuel projects, we are only making humanity's problem worse for the financial benefit of a select few. If Elizabeth Warren is serious about being a green energy champion, she needs to go on the record and say she will ban all new fossil fuel projects starting immediately. To date, there's only one candidate who's taken this position, and that's Bernie Sanders. Now, in news from across the pond, Boris Johnson was handily defeated in his first ever vote while simultaneously losing his majority in Parliament. NPR reported that a member of Johnson's party literally crossed over the aisle to sit with the opposition. Their reasoning was that they would not allow a no-deal Brexit to occur, a move that many analysts agree would be devastating for Britain's economy. Could you imagine a Western democracy like Great Britain having food shortages simply because of political actors? Events like this make us recognize the absolute cowardice of our present congressional members. If only 4 out of the 53 Senate Republicans would move across the aisle, metaphorically obviously, and turn against Trump, that would make all the difference. But they won't, and we can imagine the excuses why not. More often than not, it's likely the fear of losing their seats or their donors, which is just a reflection on the sad state of American leadership in 2019. What could be one of the most heroic moments in American history, 4 senators taking a final stance against climate denial, racism, and, as AOC would put it, the long con that is the Trump presidency, is instead left to the sidelines. No one recognizing that their actions have forever smeared their legacies. We're going to wrap it up with this week's tech news. Omar Yahi of the University of California, Berkeley reported that he and his colleagues have created a solar-powered device that could provide water for millions in water-stressed regions. At its heart is a porous crystalline material known as a metal organic framework that acts like a sponge. It sucks water vapor out of the air, even in the desert, and then releases it as liquid water. Now, he's been working on this process since 1995, but he's seen significant advancements in the technology as of lately. He's founding a company that he believes can produce microwave-sized devices that can collect 8 liters, or for those of us Americans, a little over 2 gallons of water per day. Now, as progressives, this is the kind of innovation we want to be investing in. We already understand that numerous places in the United States are struggling with water right now, and those places typically are of lower socioeconomic status. Given that the climate crisis will only make our water worries worse, proactive investment in these technologies could radically reshape our future. It would also strike a blow to the for-profit water bottling companies like Nestle and Poland Spring, which profit off of what should be a globally owned resource. Now I want to wrap up this week's progress report with a little bit of exploration of the idea of government investing in new innovations. So as a progressive, I'm not afraid to call out a good idea when I see one. And we talked about China earlier. China has really a state-guided economy. Everything in the economic realm really needs to go through China, especially at larger scale. Their central government has a lot of say in what does and does not get invested in. Compare that, for example, to the United States, which is a consumer economy. Our innovations drive the market, and I think there's a lot of merit to both. But I will say that the United States could learn a number of lessons from China in terms of the planned economy model. The challenge in the United States right now is that the very nature of our economy is changing. And one of the key problems with that change is that we are still kind of stuck in this dogmatic worship of our singular form of market economy, where we essentially have socialism for the rich through our tax codes, and rugged individualism for the poor through social programs that barely make ends meet. And the problem is, as automation continues to change the nature of work, a lot of people are going to be rapidly displaced without the ability to really transform the direction of their lives, to change the direction. I believe that we should have a deeper suite of social protections. So for example, housing, food and water, education, transportation, communication, information, healthcare, and energy should all be socialized industries with heavy public investment. In exchange for that kind of raising the floor, this deeper suite of protections where your risk of innovation, your risk of going out and opening a business becomes much lower, because if you fail, you still have the ability to feed yourself and your family. You still have a place to live. I think capitalism in its present form in America is really only for the people who can afford to fail. Speaking from personal experience, I was an entrepreneur for 8 years. I founded a company in 2011. I sold it in 2019. And I'm fortunate that it went the way it did, because if it didn't, right, if we didn't succeed, I could have been in my early 30s with no savings, no money, nothing. And I think that was a very, very fortunate aspect on my end. But as the nature of the economy shifts to a more imaginative and innovative economy, where the biggest areas of growth are coming from innovators, inventors, we want to make sure that we have as many people able to participate in that process as possible. And that's why that deeply socialized bottom helps. What that allows us to do is have a more competitive middle, more competitive than it is now. No bailouts, more people hopping in to innovate and create methods of experimentation within the process. Now, when it comes to government investment, I think that we should form new types of corporations. I call it P Corp, a Progress Corp. And I've written an essay about this. I'll link it in the description below with the rest of the source links. But the Progress Corp is essentially the idea that we can invest in companies and invest heavily in them, help them that are really doing work towards genuine social good, projects that we democratically select as a society. And there's no real caveat to the investment. We know investing in companies that you're really investing in people, in leadership, and that many companies will fail. So as a society, we accept there's a built-in risk with this, that our tax dollars may go to companies that fail. But the alternative is, when we invest in a unicorn company, let's say we take a company like Uber, which really should be socialized to begin with. It's not a profitable company, but the service it provides is pretty valuable. You could imagine a company like that being built up to the point where it is now, and then having deep encoded social responsibility into its platform. So for example, that might be X amount of net profits go to fund social projects as a return on the initial investment. It might be board members being selected randomly from the public, or maybe not randomly, but through the interview process through the public, and having specific term limits as well, to be public advocates for the product and the culture and the technology. You could imagine the best firms becoming the best schools. So we kind of now integrate, not only are we investing in these companies, but now we're also investing in education simultaneously, essentially ensuring that education in the United States doesn't just become a K through 12 or an undergrad or post-grad thing. It becomes a lifelong experience. And I think one of the best ways to do that is make our best companies our best schools. So, as progressives, when we talk about technologies, and why I like to share technologies every week on the Progress Report, is to get us thinking about how we might utilize these texts in the future, how we might want to invest in them and present them to the public as potential policies and initiatives to further our own efforts, ensuring that we understand the deep connected network of just society, of the progressive movement. We have a lot of hurdles to overcome, but I think our movement is uniquely positioned to take advantage of emerging technologies. On that note, I just want to wrap it up again. Thank you so much for tuning in to this week's Progress Report. And hey everyone, I want to ask you one final time, if you like what you hear on the Progressive Perspective, please take a moment to subscribe. You can see the button below. You can follow all of our social media links. They're also posted in the description below, and share with your friends and family. This movement is all about sharing information, and here at the Progressive Perspective, we try to provide a little bit more insight than just the latest headlines. We try to dive deep into very specific issues that matter to get people thinking not only about issues, but also about policy, about theory, about philosophy about the movement. What are we doing and why are we doing it? So I appreciate you being a part of this journey alongside me, and I hope that you'll subscribe. Thank you again for tuning into this week's Progress Report. We'll see you guys next week.